Have you ever wondered if kindness has memory? If the forest keeps accounts, tallying debts in ways we can't see until the ledger comes due? Out here in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, along the Manistee River, where the white pines grow so tall they seem to hold up the sky, there's a story folks still tell in hushed voices. It's about an old woman named Opal Thatcher, a piece of land nobody could take, and something in the woods that favors the way the ground remembers rain. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend passed down until the truth wears thin. What I'm about to tell you is based on documented reports, interviews with people who were there, and records that still sit in the county clerk's office collecting dust and questions nobody wants to answer. By the time we're done here, you'll understand why sometimes the thing that protects you doesn't wear a badge. Why kindness, real kindness, the kind that costs you something, sometimes gets repaid in ways that defy everything you thought you knew about how the world works. But before we get there, before we get to the night, 3 men showed up at Opal's cabin in a snowstorm, and what stopped them cold? We need to go back. Back to when the light was golden and autumn was doing what autumn does, turning everything beautiful right before it dies. If this story makes you think twice about what's possible, about what might be watching from the tree line when you're alone in the woods, then hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happened in those Michigan forests doesn't just challenge what you believe, it might just change it. And if you've got a story of your own, something you can't explain, something that keeps you up at night wondering, drop it in the comments. We read everyone. Now, let's begin. The light came through the birch trees like it was being filtered through cheesecloth, soft and golden, and already dying. It was late September, and the Manistee River moved slow and dark through the valley, talking to itself in that low voice rivers use when nobody's listening. The air smelled like cedar and memory, like something ending that didn't want to go. Grant Salvy's station wagon, cream-colored, clean enough to look out of place, rolled to a stop on the gravel path, about 50 yards from Opal Thatcher's cabin. He sat there a moment before getting out, engine ticking as it cooled, looking at the place like a man sizing up a job. His shoes were too polished for this part of Michigan. His coat was pressed. His smile, when he finally put it on, was the kind you practice in mirrors until it looks genuine. The cabin was small, weathered the color of dried bone, tucked into the hillside like it had grown there. Smoke curled from the chimney. A rocking chair sat empty on the porch, and hanging from the door was something that made Grant pause. A wreath made of twisted birch branches, intricate as lace, with what looked like dried berries woven through it. Not store-bought, handmade, or hand-found, or something in between. He knocked 3 times. Quick, businesslike. The kind of knock that says this is official, this won't take long. Nobody answered, but the door was unlocked. It always was. Opal didn't believe in locks. Not out here. Said they just kept out the wrong people and gave false comfort against the things that really mattered. Grant pushed the door open slow, careful not to scuff the braided rug just inside. The cabin was 1 room, maybe 2 if you counted the lean-to, out back where she kept firewood and canned goods. There was a cast-iron stove, black and serious as a heart attack. A rocking chair draped with a red and grey checkered blanket. Above the hearth, a single photograph in a wooden frame. A young couple, maybe 20 years old, standing in front of a logging truck. The woman you could see it was Opal, though 60 years, and hard living stood between that girl and the woman. She'd become wore a pale blue dress and looked at the camera like she knew something it didn't. The air inside smelled like lavender soap and old pine and something else, something harder to name. Time, maybe. Or solitude, or the particular kind of quiet that happens when a person lives alone long enough that the silence starts to have weight. "Mrs. Thatcher," Grant called out. His voice fell flat in the space, absorbed by wood and fabric and the particular density of places where people have lived their whole lives. No answer. He turned to leave, and that's when he saw it. Pinned to the inside of the door, a square of yellowed stationery held in place by a tarnished pushpin. The handwriting was delicate, the kind they used to teach in schools before cursive went out of style. Just 5 words. written in ink that had faded to the color of rust. This land is under watch. No signature, no date, just a declaration, plain and absolute, as a fence post. Grant stared at it longer than he meant to. His jaw tightened. Something about the phrasing bothered him, the way it didn't say protected or private but under watch. Like the land had eyes, like something was keeping accounts. He stepped back out into the cooling afternoon, and that's when he saw the stone. Right there at the threshold, just off-center, a smooth river rock about the size of a golf ball, perfectly round, placed with intention. And beneath it, held down like it mattered, a single dried birch leaf, curled at the edges, brown as old leather. Grant bent down to look closer. Not random, not wind-blown. Someone had put it there. Recently, too. The leaf wasn't weather-beaten, wasn't torn. He straightened up slow, his knees making sounds like old furniture. He was 62 years old, and his body reminded him of it every morning. But right now, it was his instincts that were talking, the part of him that had spent 30 years in real estate development and learned to read signs the way some men read balance sheets. This was a message, or a warning, or both. He walked back toward his car, keys already in his hand, but something made him look toward the tree line. 20 yards away, near the trail where the forest came right up to the edge of cleared land, something was wrong. The survey stakes he'd pounded into the ground last week, bright orange plastic markers, about 2 feet tall, the kind that say development coming, get ready, we're gone. No, not gone. Moved. They'd been pulled up and laid down, all 5 of them, arranged in a sweeping arc on the ground, not scattered, not tossed, arranged, bent into the dirt at an angle, all pointing the same direction, pointing at him. Grant stood there with his hand on the car door, staring at those stakes like they might explain themselves. The back of his neck prickled. The woods were quiet, too quiet, the way they get when something's watching, when the birds stop singing and the squirrels stop chattering and everything with sense enough to hide does exactly that. He got in his car and left. In his rear-view mirror, dust kicked up from his wheels like smoke, and the cabin sat there in the fading light, and the forest behind it was so still it might have been holding its breath. Inside, the cabin had gone dark except for the glow from the stove. Opal Thatcher moved through the space like a ghost tending to her own haunting, not bothering with lamps yet. She was 76 years old, and every one of those years had left its mark. Her hands were gnarled from arthritis. Her back had the permanent curve of someone who'd spent a lifetime bent over work, and her face was weathered the way wood weathers, gone silver and soft at the edges. But her eyes were sharp, always had been. She settled into her rocking chair and reached for the wooden brush on the small table beside her. Her hair, long, silver, still thick, fell over her shoulder as she began the evening ritual of brushing it out. 100 strokes, same as every night since she was a girl. Some habits were rituals, and some rituals were prayers, and some prayers were just ways of marking time when time was all you had left. On her lap was a folded piece of fabric, a scarf, deep burgundy, soft at the edges, worn in one corner from use or memory, or both. She smoothed it with one hand, then folded it once more, and laid it carefully on the empty chair across from her. Nobody sat there. Nobody had for 3 years now, not since her husband Raymond passed in his sleep one February morning, just slipped away between one breath and the next, like he'd been planning it. But she still set the chair up, still put things on it sometimes, a book he would have liked, a piece of fruit he would have eaten, not because she thought he was there, because she wanted to remember he had been. The kettle whistled. The fire settled with a soft collapse of coals. Outside, the wind picked up and moved through the trees in thin sobs, the way it does in late September when winter's coming and the forest knows it. Opal didn't hear the car leave. She didn't need to. She knew Grant Salvey had been there, could smell his cologne lingering near the door, that expensive kind that announces itself. Knew he'd read her note, knew he'd seen the leaf and the stone. Good. Some messages don't need words. Much later, deep into the night when the dark was absolute and the moon hadn't risen yet, she sat at her small table near the front window, The old ledger was open in front of her, the one where she kept records of things that mattered. When the first frost came, when the river flooded, when the ravens nested, when the deer passed through. Her handwriting was slow, careful. One line, a pause, another line, then nothing. She stopped because she heard it. Tap, a pause, tap, lange Pause, tap. 3 soft knocks, but not on the door. On the cedar siding that faced the forest, about waist-high, deliberate as a heartbeat. Opal didn't move, just let her breath go still. The pen in her hand touched nothing. Her eyes stayed on the page, but she wasn't seeing it anymore. She was listening to something older than words, older than walls, older than the agreements people make about what's possible and what isn't. The knocks hadn't come from any height that made sense for a man, not shoulder height. Lower, and the rhythm was too patient, too careful, like whatever made them knew she'd understand. She turned her head slowly toward the window. The curtains were drawn. She didn't pull them back, didn't need to. Some things you know without seeing, the way you know the sun's coming up even when the room's still dark. She spoke then, but not aloud. Just in the breath she let out, warm and full, that hung in the cool air a moment like visible prayer. Outside, the wind picked up and moved dry leaves against the cabin, siding in patterns that sounded almost like writing. The birch trees leaned, the stars stayed hidden. And just before the quiet sealed itself shut again, something moved at the edge of the clearing, slow, upright, just beyond the line of trees, not close, not far, not threat, not friend, but aware. Then the woods swallowed the movement whole, and the night went back to being just a night, and Opal reached across the table and laid her hand gently over the burgundy scarf. By morning, the leaf under the stone would still be there, darker from the dew, and if you looked close, if you knew what to look for, you'd see that another leaf had joined it. Same placement, same intention. The forest was keeping score. The frost came thick that night. By dawn it clung to everything: the cabin's eaves, the grass, the spider webs strung between fence posts, like tiny frozen hammocks. Opal's breath made clouds when she stepped out just after sunrise, coffee mug in hand, wrapped in Raymond's old barn coat that smelled like him still, motor oil and tobacco, and the particular musk of a man who'd worked outdoors his whole life. The river moved slow and dark through the trees, talking to itself. No birdsong yet, just the hush of cold settling into everything, making the world brittle. She didn't need long to notice it. The woodpile, she'd left it the way Raymond always had, stacked neat against the north side of the cabin. Biggest logs on bottom, smaller pieces on top, covered with a tarp, weighted down with stones. Enough to get through October, maybe into November, before she'd need to restack. But overnight, someone had rearranged it. The logs were still stacked, still neat, but now they formed a windbreak around the cabin's foundation, packed tight as mortar, creating an insulation barrier that would keep the cold from seeping up through the floorboards. Professional work. The kind of thing Raymond used to do every autumn, the kind of thing her arthritis meant she couldn't manage anymore. Opal stood there in the frost, mug steaming in her hands, looking at that woodpile like it might explain itself. She hadn't done it, couldn't have, not with her hands the way they were, and nobody else had been here. Nobody human, anyway. Her throat tightened, not with fear, with something harder to name. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition, or the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being cared for by something you can't see, can't touch, can't thank in any language that uses words. She bent down, slow her knees, protesting, vertebrae clicking like a rusty hinge, and touched one of the logs. The bark was cold under her fingertips. The arrangement was perfect, and tucked between two pieces, almost hidden, was a sprig of white pine, the needles still green, still fresh, tied with a strand of cedar bark. Not random, deliberate. A signature, maybe, or a promise. Opal straightened up, using the cabin wall for support, and looked out at the trees. They stood silent, patient, keeping whatever secrets forests keep. "Thank you," she said, out loud this time. Not to anyone in particular, just to the morning, to the frost, to whatever had spent the night keeping watch. The wind picked up for just a moment, moving through the pines in a sound like distant voices, then went still again. Message received. Mina Chen was 43 years old and chronically underpaid, which was pretty much the job description for a reporter at the Northern Peninsula Gazette. She'd taken the position straight out of journalism school, back when she still believed in investigative reporting and holding power accountable and all the other things they teach you in college before reality takes a red pen to your optimism. 20 years later, she mostly covered town council meetings, high school sports, and the occasional bear sighting. It wasn't the Pulitzer track career she'd imagined, but it paid enough to keep her little apartment heated and her student loans from defaulting, and there was something to be said for staying in one place long enough to watch it change, or not change. Michigan's Upper Peninsula was good at not changing, at keeping its secrets close and its stories closer, which is why when Sheriff Frank Petrie called her that Tuesday morning, voice tight as bridge cable, she knew something was different. You need to come out to the Thatcher property, he said. No preamble, no small talk, just the address and come now. The drive took 40 minutes, most of it on 2-lane roads that wound through forest so dense the sunlight barely touched ground. Mina's Honda rattled over potholes and frost heaves, NPR cutting in and out, depending on the hills, until finally she turned onto the gravel path that led to Opal Thatcher's cabin. 3 vehicles were already there. Frank's patrol car, a fish and wildlife truck, and Grant Salvy's cream-colored station wagon. Bad combination. When developers and law enforcement showed up together at a property, it usually meant someone was about to lose something they'd fought hard to keep. Mina grabbed her camera bag and notebook and got out. The morning was cold enough to hurt, the kind of cold that finds every gap in your clothing and crawls in to stay. She zipped her jacket higher and walked toward where the men stood in a loose cluster near the tree line, their voices low and tense. Frank saw her first. He was 61, a year from retirement, and looked like every year had left a scar. Face weathered as barnwood, gut pushing against his uniform belt, eyes that had seen too much and didn't trust easily anymore. They'd worked together enough times that he didn't try to send her away, just nodded once and stepped aside so she could see what they were looking at. Survey stakes. The same ones Grant had mentioned. The bright orange plastic markers that development companies use to mark boundaries and claim territory. All 5 of them pulled up and arranged on the ground in that same arc, points facing inward like accusatory fingers. But that wasn't what had Frank's jaw tight. It was the tracks. They started about 15 feet back in the soft earth where the forest floor was still damp from overnight frost. Clear as photographs, deep enough to show weight, wide enough to make your stomach drop. Footprints, if you wanted to call them that. They were shaped roughly like a human foot heel. Arch, 5 toes but scaled up like someone had hit the enlarge button until reality broke. 18 inches long, maybe more. 8 inches wide at the ball. The toes had left distinct impressions, each one bigger than Mina's thumb. The stride between prints was impossible. 4 feet, maybe 5, like whatever made them had legs that didn't follow the same rules as human anatomy. Mina knelt down slow, camera already up, motor drive clicking as she shot from multiple angles. The impressions were deep, at least 2 inches, which meant weight, serious weight, 300 pounds, minimum, maybe more. The edges were clean, no blur, no drag marks. Whatever made, these had stepped carefully, deliberately, like it knew exactly where it was going and didn't need to hurry. She looked up at Frank. Please tell me there's a logical explanation. His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. You got one? Hoax? She didn't sound convinced, even as she said it. That's option 1. Frank rubbed the back of his neck. Option 2 is we've got a problem that doesn't fit on a report form. Grant Salvy stepped forward. He looked different than he had in town council meetings, smaller somehow. Like the forest had a way of shrinking men used to office buildings and contracts. I want this documented. Official record. I've got investors who need to know. What you've got, Frank interrupted, voice flat as Bible pages, is something that pulled up your stakes and left prints that shouldn't exist. You want that in an official report. Be my guest. Just know what people are going to think when they read it. I know what they'll think. Grant's voice had an edge now. They'll think this woman, he gestured vaguely toward the cabin, is running some kind of con to scare off development. Opal Thatcher, 76 years old, Mina said without looking up from her camera. You think she's out here in the middle of the night wearing Bigfoot stilts? I think someone is. Then where's the second set of tracks? She stood up, pointed. These prints are in soft ground. If someone was wearing fake feet, we'd see their real prints somewhere. Scuff marks, drag trails, something. Instead, we've got these, she gestured at the impossible footprints, and nothing else. The four of them stood there in the cold morning, each one doing math in their head, trying to make the evidence fit a world that made sense. It didn't fit. The fish and wildlife officer, a kid named Darren who looked maybe 30 and still had the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't learned to be cynical yet, cleared his throat. I've seen bear prints look weird when they step partial. Maybe if one came through. Bears don't pull up survey stakes and arrange them, Frank said. Maybe the stakes were already loose. Wind could have. Wind doesn't line things up. Mina cut him off. Not unkindly. Wind scatters. Silence settled over them like frost. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, harsh and lonely. The woods didn't answer back. Finally, Grant spoke. I want samples. Soil analysis. Whatever this is, I want it documented that something's interfering with development rights on this property. Frank's jaw worked. I'll file a report. But Chen here is right, we put this in official records. People are going to talk. And not the kind of talk that helps your land values. Let them talk. You sure about that? Mina lowered her camera, looked at him direct. Because once this gets out, and it will get out, that's how small towns work. You're going to have every cryptid hunter and amateur paranormal investigator in a 3-state radius crawling through these woods. You want that circus. Grant's face tightened. He hadn't thought about that. You could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Property value versus publicity. Investors versus internet fame. Neither option looked good. I'll think about it, he said finally, which was businessman for no. He walked back to his station wagon, shoes crunching on gravel, and drove away without another word. Frank waited until the sound of the engine faded before turning to Mina, off the record. When am I ever on the record with you, Frank? The corner of his mouth ticked up, almost a smile. Fair point. He looked back at the tracks, hands on his belt, the universal stance of law enforcement encountering problems that don't have procedures. 34 years I've been in this county. Seen a lot of weird things. Found a car once with a deer inside it. Inside, like the deer had been driving. Had a guy call in that his wife had been replaced by a duplicate. Turned out, she'd just gotten a haircut. He paused. This is different. Different how? Different like I don't know what to write in the report. Different like I'm 61 years old, and I don't want to spend my last year on the job explaining to state police why I filed paperwork about Bigfoot. Mina almost laughed. Would've, if the moment wasn't so strange, if the tracks weren't so clear in the soft earth, if the morning wasn't so cold and still and waiting. You believe in this stuff? She asked. Frank was quiet a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, private, the kind of thing you only say when you're tired of pretending. I believe there's more in these woods than we give credit for. I believe people see things they can't explain and spend the rest of their lives trying to make sense of it. And I believe. He trailed off, looked at the cabin where smoke was rising, lazy from the chimney. I believe Opal Thatcher's lived out here 76 years and never had trouble until someone decided this land was worth money. You think she's protecting it. I think the land is protecting her. That hung in the cold air between them. Too big to argue with, too strange to accept. Mina took a few more photos, measurements with a tape measure she kept in her bag, notes in shorthand that would make sense later when she had coffee and distance. and wasn't standing in the middle of evidence that shouldn't exist. Before she left, she walked up to the cabin and knocked. No answer at first. Then the door opened slow, and there was Opal Thatcher, tiny, bent, eyes sharp as broken glass. She wore a faded house dress under a cardigan that might have been red once, but had faded to the color of old brick. Her hair was braided and pinned up, silver as February ice. Her hands gripped the doorframe, knuckles swollen from arthritis. Mrs. Thatcher. Mina kept her voice gentle. I'm Mina Chen, from the Gazette. Sheriff Petrie called me out here about some tracks they found. I was wondering if you'd seen anything unusual recently. Opal looked past her at where Frank was still standing by the tree line, then back at Mina. Her face didn't change. Define unusual. Fair question. Mina almost smiled. Large footprints, rearranged survey stakes, anything that seemed out of place. Out of place. Opal repeated it like she was tasting the words, finding them inadequate. Young lady, I've lived on this land since before your parents were born. I know every tree, every stone, every sound these woods make when they're happy and when they're not. Things are exactly where they're supposed to be. It's the surveyors who are out of place. You know about the development plans. I know Grant Salvi wants to turn this valley into vacation homes for people who'll be here 2 weeks a year and spend the rest of their time calling their property rustic. I know he's offered me money to sell. Good money. More money than this cabin's worth on any assessment. She paused. I also know money doesn't buy everything. You're not interested in selling? Opal's eyes went distant, looking past Mina toward the forest. My husband's buried up on that hill. My parents before him, their parents before them. You want to know what I'm interested in? Keeping promises, staying put, letting the forest do what forests do. She turned back to Mina. That answer your question, Mrs. Thatcher? Someone or something pulled up Mr. Salvi's survey stakes last night, rearranged them, left tracks that don't match any animal I know. You have any idea who might have done that? For a long moment, Opal didn't answer. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like recognition of a joke, only she understood. Sometimes the forest speaks for itself, she said. You just have to listen. Then she closed the door, gentle but final, and Mina was left standing on the porch with more questions than she'd come with. On her way back to her car, she passed the spot where the leaf sat beneath the smooth stone. She almost missed it would have, if the morning light hadn't caught the edge of something that looked deliberate. She knelt down, careful not to disturb it, and saw what Grant had seen. The placement too intentional to be random, the stone too smooth to be accidental. She took one last photo. As she drove away, dust kicking up behind her Honda, she looked in her rear-view mirror and saw Opal standing at the window, backlit by firelight, watching her go. And behind the cabin, just at the edge where the clearing met the forest, something tall moved between the trees. There for a second, gone the next. Like a thought half remembered, Mina drove faster. Back in her apartment that night, a 2-room walk-up above the hardware store, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbors' conversations through the walls and smell whatever they were cooking. Mina spread the photos across her kitchen table. The tracks were clear in every shot. 18 inches, 5 toes. Stride length that made her stomach tight. She'd covered enough stories to know when evidence was solid and when it was ambiguous. This wasn't ambiguous. This was a problem. She opened her laptop and started typing. Not an article. Not yet. Just notes. Questions. Things that didn't fit. Survey stakes removed and arranged. Why? No human prints nearby. How? Opal isn't scared. Why? Woodpile restacked professionally overnight. Birch wreath on. Door handmade or found. Note. This land is under watch. By who? She stared at that last question until her eyes hurt. Then she did what reporters do when normal channels fail. She started digging. The Peninsula Historical Society had records going back to 1847 when the first lumber camps had pushed into these forests and found white pines so big it took 6 men to fell one tree. Back when the Manistee River was a highway for logs, when the woods were full of men whose names were forgotten now but whose work had stripped these mountains bare, replanted them, stripped them again. Opal's family had been here through all of it. The Thatchers had worked the lumber drives, survived the fires, watched the forests recover. They'd been here long enough to become part of the land, the way some families do, rooted so deep that removing them would be like pulling out a tree and expecting the hill not to collapse. Mina cross-referenced property records, historical accounts, old newspaper archives, found something interesting. A note in the Historical Society files from 1962, handwritten by someone named Martin Voss, who'd been keeping records of local folklore. It mentioned the Thatcher property specifically, said there'd been reports since the logging days of something in the woods that didn't take kindly to certain kinds of men. Men who were cruel, men who took more than their share, men who treated the forest like an enemy instead of a provider. The note ended with a sentence Mina read 3 times. The old-timers say the forest has watchers, and the Thatchers know how to listen. She sat back, coffee gone cold, laptop screen dimming. The forest has watchers. Opal's note had said, "This land is under watch, not by her, by something else." Mina closed the laptop. Some stories, you know instinctively, are bigger than they seem, deeper than the facts allow. This was one of those stories. She'd covered dozens of them over 20 years, the child who went missing in the state park and turned up 3 days later with no memory but no harm. The winter, when deer would gather in certain yards and nowhere else. The stretch of Route 41, where accidents happened at the same mile marker, every November like clockwork. Most of the time, there were explanations, mundane ones. Kids getting lost and finding their way back. Deer following food sources, bad road design and seasonal weather. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes the explanation required believing in things that didn't fit on official forms. Mina had learned to recognize those stories by feel. They had a weight to them, a density. Like truth, wrapped in something that defied standard definitions of what truth was allowed to be. This was one of those stories. She went to bed that night, with the photos still spread across her table, and dreamed of footprints in the snow, each one impossibly deep, leading into forest that had no end. The next morning, a Tuesday cold enough to make breathing hurt, Mina drove back out to the property. Not because she had new questions, because she had no answers. Frank's patrol car was already there. So was another vehicle she recognized. Owen Doherty's pickup truck, Forest Service logo on the door, rust on the fenders. Owen was maybe 65, had been managing these woods longer than most of the trees had been growing. If anyone would know what was possible out here, it'd be him. She found them both at the Treeline, standing over the tracks again. The frost had preserved them perfectly. If anything, they looked more defined now, like the cold had sharpened the details. Owen looked up when Mina approached, nodded once. He was the kind of man who measured words carefully, spent them like money that wouldn't come back. His face had the permanent tan of someone who worked outside, deep lines around his eyes from squinting at horizons. He wore Carhartt overalls and a flannel that had seen better decades. "Morning," Mina said. "Morning." Owen's voice was gravel. "Frank, tell you about the birch?" "The birch?" Frank pointed behind them, toward a stand of white birch, maybe 30 yards deeper in. "Come look." They walked in silence, boots crunching on frozen ground, breath-making clouds. The morning was so still the sound of their movement felt like an intrusion, like they were disturbing something that preferred to be left alone. The birch trees stood in a loose cluster, their white bark stark against the darker pines behind them, but something was wrong with one of them. The bark had been stripped in a perfect circle about 7 feet, up the trunk, not torn or clawed, but peeled, deliberate as surgery, and woven into the exposed wood was a pattern, not random scratches. A pattern. Mina got closer. The pattern was made from smaller strips of birch bark, twisted and interlaced, creating a design that looked almost like a rosette. Intricate work, the kind of thing that takes time, patience, careful hands. Or careful, something else. Basket weaving, Owen said quietly. Native technique. They'd strip the bark in spring when it's flexible, weave it into designs. This is old-style work, real old. You're saying someone out here knows traditional Native American basket weaving. Mina pulled out her camera, started shooting. I'm saying someone or something made this in the last 48 hours. Bark still fresh, hasn't dried out yet. Frank shifted his weight, hands on his belt. We checked for tracks leading to it. There aren't any, just those. He pointed back toward the survey stakes, which don't come this far. Mina's mouth went dry. So whatever made this, either flew here, Owen said, or knows how to walk without leaving signs. Both options suck. She took more photos, angles, details. The way the bark strips were woven tight, professional, perfect. Then she looked up at the 7-foot height. Why there? Why that high? Owen and Frank exchanged a look. The kind of look that meant they'd already discussed this, already tried to make sense of it, already failed. Eye level, Frank said finally. If you were 7 feet tall, the three of them stood there in the cold morning, looking at evidence that didn't fit any narrative that made sense. A pattern made with skill and care, placed at a height that required reach no human had, in a spot with no tracks leading to it or away from it. If you were 7 feet tall, Owen repeated quietly, like saying it out loud, might make it less impossible. Mina stepped back, looked at the design from different angles. Her journalism training was screaming at her to find the rational explanation. Someone on a ladder, someone with a drone, someone with too much time and a weird sense of humor. But her instincts, the part that had kept her alive and employed for 20 years, covering stories in places where cell phones didn't work and help was hours away, were saying something different. They were saying, "Pay attention. This matters." "I need to talk to Opal," she said. The cabin door opened before Mina could knock. Opal stood there in the same faded dress, same cardigan, but her hair was down now, silver and long enough to reach her waist. She looked smaller in the doorway, more fragile, but her eyes were still sharp. "Figured you'd be back," Opal said. Not unfriendly, just stating fact. "Mrs. Thatcher, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. I'm 76 years old. Being anything other than straight is too much work. Despite everything, the impossible tracks, the woven bark, the cold settling into her bones." Mina smiled. "Fair enough. Do you know what's out there?" Opal was quiet for a long moment. Then she stepped back, opened the door wider. "You want coffee? Please." The interior was warm from the wood stove, smelled like cedar, and something baking bread, maybe, or biscuits. Opal moved slowly to the stove, poured coffee into 2 chipped ceramic mugs. Her hands shook slightly from the arthritis, but she didn't spill a drop. Muscle memory from decades of the same motion, the same morning ritual. She handed Mina a mug and settled into her rocking chair. Gestured to the other chair, the one with the burgundy scarf folded on the seat. "You can move that," Opal said. "It's just old habit." Mina moved the scarf carefully, sat down. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, the way people used to make it before fancy machines and precise measurements. It was perfect. "You asked if I know what's out there," Opal said. "That's not quite the right question." "What's the right question?" "The right question is, does it matter what I call it, or does it matter that it's there?" Mina sipped her coffee, waited. Old journalist trick. Silence makes people talk. Opal smiled like she knew exactly what Mina was doing. "You're smarter than most who come through here. Grant Salvi, for instance. Man's got degrees and money and connections, but he doesn't understand the first thing about this place. Thinks everything's got a price. Thinks if you can't put it in a contract, it doesn't exist. And you know different? I know what my grandmother told me, and what her grandmother told her. I know there are things in these woods older than the towns, older than the roads, older than the idea that you could own land by signing a piece of paper. She paused, rocked slowly. My family's been here since 1847. We came for the lumber, same as everyone else. Cut down trees so big you could hollow them out and live inside. Made fortunes doing it. Destroyed these forests doing it. But you stayed. We stayed. And we learned. See, most people, they came, took what they wanted, left. The forest was just resources. Trees were just lumber. Animals were just meat or problems. But some of us, we figured out that if you're going to live somewhere, you need to live with it, not just on it. You need to understand it has rules. And if you break those rules, there are consequences. Mina set her coffee down, pulled out her notebook. May I? Opal nodded. What kind of rules? Don't take more than you need. Don't waste. Don't be cruel. Treat the forest like it's alive, because it is not alive like people are alive, but alive in ways that matter. And if something helps you, you help it back. When you say something, I mean something that lives out there. Something that's been here longer than us. Something that watches. Opal leaned forward slightly, voice dropping. My grandmother called them the unnamed. Said they were here before the tribes, before the ice, before time meant anything. Said they kept to themselves mostly, but they noticed things, remembered things. And if you did right by the forest, they'd do right by you. And if you didn't, Opal's face went still. Then the forest made sure you left. One way or another. The wood stove popped, a log settling. Outside, wind moved through the trees in a sound like distant voices. Mrs. Thatcher, I saw the tracks. I saw the bark weaving. I need you to tell me, do you believe something supernatural is protecting this property? Supernatural. Opal turned the word over like a stone, looking at it from different sides. That's a city word. Means something outside nature. But what I'm talking about is just nature. Just nature bigger and stranger than most people are comfortable with. She looked at Mina directly. Yes, I believe something is protecting this land. And yes, I believe it's doing it because of choices my family made a long time ago. What choices? Opal stood up slowly, using the chair arm for support, and walked to the shelf above the fireplace. She took down the photograph Mina had seen on her first visit the young couple in front of the logging truck. This is my father, Opal said, pointing to the young man. Samuel Thatcher, taken in 1912. He was 19 years old, already working the lumber camps, strong as an ox, smart as they come, and stubborn enough to make mules look flexible. She sat back down, held the photo in her lap. That winter, 1912, there was an accident at the camp. A cable snapped during a log drive, caught a man named Joseph Bellamy across the chest. Broke him open. Nobody thought he'd live through the night, but he did barely. They carried him to the camp doctor, but the doctor was drunk, useless. My father sat with Joseph all night, kept pressure on the wound, talked to him so he wouldn't slip away. Toward dawn, Joseph started saying strange things, talking about something he'd seen in the woods, something that had helped him once when he was lost. Said he'd given it food from his pack, said it remembered. What did he see? He never said exactly, just kept calling it the tall one. Said it walked like a man but wasn't one, said it had eyes that understood. Opal stroked the edge of the photograph with her thumb. Joseph died at sunrise. My father buried him up on the hill where my husband is now. But before he died, he made my father promise something. If the tall one ever needed help, if the forest ever needed someone to stand up for it, our family would do it. No questions, no hesitation. That's a hell of a promise. It is. But my father kept it. When the logging companies wanted to clear-cut this whole valley in 1923, strip it bare and move on, my father bought the land. Used every penny he had, went into debt he'd spend the rest of his life paying off, kept 300 acres wild, let it recover. And you think, what? That something out there remembers that. Opal looked toward the window. The light was changing, getting that golden quality it gets in late morning, like honey poured through air. I think debt works both ways. I think kindness has memory. And I think if you spend your whole life keeping a promise, sometimes the promise keeps you back. Mina wrote that down word for word. Then she asked the question she'd been building toward. Mrs. Thatcher, what do you think is going to happen when Grant Salvey pushes this development through? When he brings construction crews and equipment and tears into this forest? Opal's face was calm, almost peaceful. I think the forest will say no. And if he doesn't listen, then he'll learn what happens when you ignore something that's been here since the world was young and has less patience than it used to. They sat in silence for a while, just the two of them, and the morning, and the weight of things that couldn't be proven, but couldn't be denied either. Finally, Mina stood. Thank you for the coffee. And for being honest. You planning to write about this? I don't know yet. If I do, it'll sound crazy. Most true things do. Opal smiled, but there was sadness in it. Just remember, some stories aren't about making people believe. They're about making people think, about possibility, about respect, about the fact that we're not as alone as we think we are, and not as important as we'd like to be. Mina left the cabin with more questions than answers, and a story she had no idea how to tell. 3 days later, things escalated. Grant Salvey filed formal paperwork with the county to begin preliminary surveys. He'd lined up investors from Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, people with money who wanted what they called authentic wilderness experience, but with good Wi-Fi and granite countertops. He had architectural renderings of vacation homes that looked like they'd been copy-pasted from Colorado, all dark wood and floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of places that cost 7 figures and got used 2 weeks a year. He'd also hired a private security firm to ensure site access, which was legal speak for make sure nobody interferes. Mina got wind of it through a contact at the county clerk's office and drove out to the property that afternoon. She arrived to find 4 men in tactical gear, black pants, black jackets with Titan security printed on the back, walking the perimeter with clipboards and cameras. Grant was there too, standing by his station wagon, talking on his phone. He looked up when Mina's Honda rattled to a stop, and his face tightened. No press, he said, covering his phone. This is private property. It's Opal Thatcher's private property, actually. You're just doing surveys, which makes it news. Mina got out with her camera. How about a comment for the Gazette? Local developer hires armed security for land assessment. That's a hell of a headline. They're not armed. They're professional site security. They've got sidearms. Grant glanced at the security team, then back at her. This is a remote location. Wildlife can be dangerous. Speaking of dangerous wildlife, you had any more incidents? More tracks? More rearranged stakes? His jaw tightened. No comment. That's interesting, because I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, that 3 of your survey markers went missing last night. Not just pulled up. Gone. Is that accurate? Grant's silence was answer enough. You know what I think. Mina stepped closer, voice dropping. I think you're scared. I think something's happening out here that you can't explain, can't control, and it's making your investors nervous. I think you brought these guys, she gestured, at the security team not to protect you from bears, but to protect you from whatever keeps sending you messages you don't want to hear. You want to know what I think? Grant's voice was tight. I think this whole thing is a con. I think Opal Thatcher, or someone she hired, is playing games to drive down property value so she can hold out for more money. And I think you're helping her by writing these ridiculous stories about. He stopped himself. About what? Bigfoot. Mina smiled without warmth. I haven't published anything yet, Grant. Everything I've seen has stayed in my notes. But if you want to make this public, if you want to turn this into a story about a developer who can't handle a little rural resistance, I'm happy to help. They stared at each other for a long moment. Grant broke first. Just stay out of the way, he muttered, and walked off toward his security team. Mina stayed long enough to photograph the men walking the property, noting how they moved nervous, heads on swivels, hands near their weapons, even though nothing threatened them. They looked like soldiers in enemy territory. And maybe they were. That night, Mina couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Opal had said. Debt works both ways. Kindness has memory. At 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep and opened her laptop. Started researching everything she could find about the Thatcher family, the logging camps, the history of Manistee River Valley. What she found was fragmentary, but consistent. There were stories going back over 100 years, stories about things in the woods. Most of them were folklore, the kind of tales loggers told around fires about a tall walker that would lead lost men back to camp, about trees that would fall away from workers at the last second, about animals that would disappear when cruel men were near. But there were also official records, incident reports from lumber companies. A note from 1919 about a foreman named Victor Krantz who'd been beating his crew, forcing men to work past exhaustion. He disappeared one night after walking into the woods to relieve himself. They found his boots 2 miles from camp, placed neatly side by side on a rock. His body was never found. Another report from 1934. A group of hunters who'd been shooting does out of season, leaving the meat to rot, taking only the heads for trophies. They came back to their truck to find it flipped over, windows smashed, all their guns bent in half. They reported it as vandalism, but the investigating ranger noted that the truck was too heavy for any human to flip, and the guns looked like they'd been bent by hand, which would require strength that didn't exist in humans. The ranger's name was Andrew Voss, same last name as the folklore collector Mina had found earlier. She followed that thread, found Andrew Voss's personal journals donated to the Historical Society after his death in 1967, scanned PDFs available online, handwritten entries that were hard to read but worth the effort. One entry from October 1951 caught her attention. Spoke today with Samuel Thatcher, now 58 years old. Asked him directly about the stories. He was reluctant at first, but after I promised this would remain private, he told me what his father had told him, that there are watchers in these woods, older than memory. They keep the forest in balance. They remember kindness and punish cruelty. They are not spirits, not ghosts, but living things that we don't have names for. Samuel says his family made a covenant with them generations ago. The Thatchers would protect the land, and the Watchers would protect the Thatchers. He said he's kept that covenant his whole life, and his daughter Opal would keep it after him. He was certain of this, the way some men are certain of God. Mina sat back, heart hammering. A covenant, a promise kept for generations. She thought about Opal in her cabin, 76 years old, alone, refusing to sell no matter how much money was offered. Thought about the woodpile restacked overnight, the birch bark weaving, the tracks that shouldn't exist. She thought about Grant Salvey and his investors, about men who saw land as investment rather than trust, about development that would tear into 300 acres of forest that had been protected for a century. And she thought about what happens when you break a covenant that old, that deep, that serious. Nothing good. She closed her laptop, sat in the dark of her apartment, listening to the heating system clank and her neighbor's TV murmuring through the walls, the ordinary sounds of ordinary life. But out there, in the forest along the Manistee River, things were happening that weren't ordinary at all. Things that were old, things that remembered, things that were running out of patience. The weather changed on November 3rd. Temperature dropped 15 degrees overnight. Snow came in the kind of storm that erases the world heavy, wet, relentless. By morning, the peninsula was buried under 8 inches, and the forecast said more was coming. Mina tried calling Opal. No answer. Cell service was spotty out there, even in good weather, and in a storm like this, it was non-existent. She told herself not to worry. Opal had lived through 76 winters. She knew how to handle snow, but something felt wrong. That reporter's instinct again, the one that had kept her alive and employed. Something was coming. She wasn't the only one who felt it. Frank Petrie sat in his patrol car outside the sheriff's office, coffee going cold in his hand, staring at nothing. He'd been a cop for 34 years. He knew when a situation was building towards something bad. He'd seen it before: domestic disputes that simmered for months before exploding, feuds between neighbors that went from angry words to violence, conflicts that seemed manageable right up until they weren't. This thing with the Thatcher property had that feeling. Like pressure building behind a dam. Like thunder before lightning. He picked up his radio. "Dispatch. This is Sheriff Petrie. I'm heading out to the Thatcher property. Just checking on the resident. Should be back in an hour." "Static then. Copy that, Sheriff. Be careful. Roads are bad." "Aren't they always?" Frank muttered, and put the car in gear. Grant Salvi was having the worst week of his professional life. 2 of his investors had pulled out after reading Mina's preliminary article in the Gazette, not about Bigfoot, but about unexplained incidents on proposed development site. Just facts, just questions, but enough to make nervous money more nervous. His security team had quit after 3 nights of what they called psychological warfare. They wouldn't elaborate, just said the woods at night were wrong, and they weren't coming back at any price. And this morning, he'd found his station wagon's tires slashed. All 4 of them, clean cuts, professional. The security cameras he'd installed at his rental house showed nothing, just hours of snow falling in the dark. Then him coming out in the morning to find his car sitting on 4 flats. He was done being polite, done being patient, done pretending this was about respect for rural traditions or environmental concerns or any of the other bullshit people used when they didn't want progress. This was about money, his money. Money he'd already promised to investors. Money tied up in architectural plans and permits and preliminary surveys. Money that was evaporating while an old woman played games. He made calls. Found a different security company, one that specialized in difficult evictions. Told them he needed to deliver an ultimatum to a squatter on property he was in the process of acquiring. Offered triple their usual rate for same-day service in bad weather. They agreed. By 7 p.m., 3 men were driving north in a black SUV with chains on the tires. Their names were Kyle, Marcus, and Derek. They were all in their 40s, ex-military, experienced in what they called persuasion services. They'd done this kind of work before showing up at properties where people didn't want to leave, making it clear that refusal wasn't an option. They didn't carry guns, didn't need to. The threat was enough. 3 large men in tactical gear showing up in a snowstorm, making it clear that the law was flexible and kindness had limits. What they didn't know, what Grant hadn't told them, because he was embarrassed to admit, it was the history of the property. The incidents, the tracks, the warnings. They didn't know about the covenant. They didn't know that some places have protectors. And they didn't know that those protectors were watching. Frank got to the property around 8 p.m., snow coming down so heavy his wipers barely kept up. The world was white and silent, sound muffled by the storm, visibility maybe 20 feet. Opal's cabin glowed warm in the dark, firelight visible through the windows. Smoke rose straight up from the chimney before the wind caught it and tore it apart. Frank felt some of his worry ease. She was okay, probably asleep or reading by the fire, the way people used to do before screens devoured everyone's attention. He was about to turn around and head back when he saw headlights cutting through the snow behind him. A black SUV, moving too fast for conditions, chains rattling. Frank's stomach dropped. He knew that vehicle type, knew what it meant. He parked across the driveway, blocking access, and got out. Put his hand on his sidearm but didn't draw it. Professional presence, nothing more. The SUV stopped, and 3 men got out, big guys, tactical gear, faces hard in the way that comes from seeing things and doing things and not caring much about either anymore. "Gentlemen," Frank said, voice calm, authoritative. "This is private property. You need to turn around." The one in front, Kyle, though Frank didn't know that yet, kept walking. "We're here on behalf of the property owner. This is a legal matter. The property owner is inside that cabin. Her name's Opal Thatcher. And whatever Mr. Salvi told you, you're not coming on this land tonight." Kyle smiled. Not a friendly smile. The smile of a man who'd heard authority before and learned to ignore it. You know how many times we've heard that? Small town sheriff protecting squatters. We know the law. We know our rights. We're not leaving until we deliver our message. Your message can wait until morning, can it? Kyle stepped closer. Because Mr. Salvi's been very patient, very generous, and he's tired of being ignored. So here's how this works. We knock on that door. We have a conversation with the old lady. We make sure she understands the situation. Then we leave. Nobody gets hurt. Everyone understands the stakes. Frank's jaw tightened. I said no, Marcus. Second guy, almost as big as Kyle, moved to Frank's left, flanking position. Derek took the right. Classic intimidation formation. Surround, isolate, overwhelm. Sheriff, Kyle said, voice dropping to something that might have been reasonable if it wasn't threaded with contempt. You're one man, in a snowstorm, miles from backup. Now, we respect the badge. We do. But badges don't change math. Step aside. Frank's hand stayed on his weapon. I'm asking you one more time, and we're ignoring you one more time. Kyle started walking toward the cabin. Frank drew his weapon. Stop right there. All three men stopped, turned slowly. Their faces showed no fear, just calculation, measuring risk against reward, determining if an elderly sheriff in bad weather was worth the trouble. Kyle raised his hands slowly, but he was smiling. Sheriff, you really want to do this? You want to shoot us for knocking on a door? Because that's what this is about. We're not breaking in. We're not threatening anyone. We're just delivering a message. At 8 o'clock at night, in a snowstorm, 3 armed men showing up at an elderly woman's home. That's called menacing. That's called trespassing. That's called about 12 things I can arrest you for. Then arrest us. Kyle's smile widened. Call for backup. Get the prosecutor on the phone. Let's make this official. While you're doing that, we'll wait right here. In the cold. In the snow. 3 guys who were just trying to do their job, getting held at gunpoint by a sheriff who's maybe a little too protective of someone who isn't playing by the rules. Frank's finger rested on the trigger guard. Not on the trigger, he had too much training for that, but close enough that the message was clear. The problem was, Kyle was right about the math. 3 against 1. No backup for at least 30 minutes in this weather, probably longer. And if he called it in, if he made this official, he'd have to explain why he'd pulled his weapon on 3 men who technically hadn't done anything illegal yet. The badge didn't change math, but Frank had spent 34 years learning that sometimes math doesn't matter. Sometimes you draw a line because it needs drawing, consequences be damned. Last chance, Frank said. Get back in your vehicle and leave. Kyle sighed, like Frank was being unreasonable, like this was all very disappointing. Okay. We'll go, but we're coming back tomorrow, with paperwork, with lawyers, with everything we need to do this the legal way. And when we do, Sheriff, you're going to wish you'd let us handle this quietly. He turned, gestured to Marcus and Derek. They started walking back toward the SUV. Frank felt his heart rate slow slightly. Crisis averted. For now, that's when he heard it. A sound from the woods. Not wind. Not snow, not branches creaking under the weight of ice. A crack, sharp, deliberate, like something heavy stepping on frozen ground. All 4 men turned toward the tree line. The forest was a wall of darkness beyond the reach of Frank's flashlight. Snow fell through the beam in hypnotic patterns, making it hard to see anything clearly. But there was movement back there. Large movement. Something shifting between trees that were spaced too far apart for anything human-sized to hide behind. What the hell was that? Marcus's voice had lost its edge, replaced by something younger, more uncertain. Another crack. Closer this time. Frank's flashlight caught something. A shape, maybe 8 feet tall, moving behind a stand of white pine. There for a second, gone the next. Like shadow, but with weight, with presence. Jesus Christ, Derek whispered. The smell hit them then. Every cop knows the smell of fear, sweat, adrenaline, the particular musk of mammals when they realize their prey. But this was different. This was wild. It smelled like turned earth and cedar, and something older than memory, something that had never learned to be civilized or tame, or bound by rules, made by creatures who'd only been walking upright for a few thousand years. Kyle's hand went to his sidearm. "Who's there? Identify yourself." Silence. Just the snow and the wind and the sound of their own breathing. Too loud, too fast. Then, from the darkness, a sound that made Frank's blood cold. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not on wood. On something hollow bone, maybe, or the trunk of a dead tree. The rhythm was identical to the knocks Opal had heard that first night. Patient. Intentional. A message. "Fuck this," Marcus said, voice shaking. "Fuck this. I'm out." He started backing toward the SUV. That's when it stepped into the light. Not all the way, just enough that Frank's flashlight caught the edge of it. The outline, the suggestion of something that his brain couldn't quite process because the size was wrong, the proportions were impossible, the shoulders were too broad and the legs were too long and the head was too high. It stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, covered in something that might have been hair but looked rougher, more like bark or fur that hadn't seen grooming in 1,000 years. The face, if you could call it that, was mostly shadow, but Frank caught a glimpse of eyes that reflected his flashlight in a way human eyes don't, a greenish gold glow that was there and gone. The creature didn't move toward them, didn't advance, just stood there at the edge of the clearing, visible enough to be seen, far enough to remain mostly unknown, watching, waiting, making it very clear who this land belonged to. Kyle had his weapon out now, hands shaking despite all his training. "What the fuck is that?" "That," Frank said quietly, holstering his own weapon, "is your warning and mine. This land is protected, has been for over 100 years. You don't want to be here, trust me." "Shoot it," Derek hissed. "Shoot it. You shoot anything," Frank said, voice sharp as broken glass. "And you better pray it kills you quick, because if it doesn't, you're going to learn what happens when you make something like that angry." The creature tilted its head, the motion almost curious. Then it raised one hand, and calling it a hand was generous. It was more like a collection of fingers, too long and too thick, bark dark and powerful, and gestured, not toward them, toward the forest. The meaning was clear. Leave. Kyle backed toward the SUV, weapon still out, eyes never leaving the creature. Marcus and Derek were already at the vehicle, doors open, engine running. "Sheriff," Kyle said, voice tight, "I don't know what the hell that is. I don't want to know, and I'm filing a report that this property is a public safety hazard. Whatever Salvi's paying us isn't worth this." "Smart man," Frank said. The 3 men got in their SUV and reversed out in a spray of snow and gravel, chains rattling, exhaust white in the cold air. Frank watched them go, then slowly turned back toward the tree line. The creature was still there. But now it was closer, had moved while Frank was distracted, covered 20 feet of ground, without making a sound, without leaving a mark in the fresh snow. Frank kept his hands visible, away from his weapon. "I'm here to check on Opal. Make sure she's okay in the storm. That's all." The creature didn't respond. Didn't need to. Frank could feel the intelligence behind those eyes, the awareness. This wasn't an animal. This was something that understood, that listened, that judged. "I'm not here to hurt anything," Frank continued. "I'm not here to take anything. I'm just doing my job." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the creature stepped back, merging with the darkness so completely it was like it had never been there. The smell faded. The pressure in the air eased. Frank let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His hands were shaking. He was 61 years old, had seen car accidents and murder scenes and things that would keep most people up at night. But this was different. This was meeting something that shouldn't exist and having it look at you like it was deciding whether you deserved to keep existing. He walked to Opal's cabin on legs that felt less steady than they should, knocked gently. "Mrs. Thatcher." "It's Sheriff Petrie. You all right in there?" The door opened. Opal stood there in her nightgown and that faded cardigan, hair braided for sleep. She looked at Frank, then past him at the forest, then back at him. "You saw it," she said. "Not a question. I saw something. And I understand now why you won't sell." Opal's smile was sad and knowing. Good. Maybe now other people will understand too. She paused. "You want coffee? You look like you could use it." Frank almost said no, almost got in his car and drove away and spent the rest of his retirement trying to forget what he'd seen. But something in Opal's face stopped him, the loneliness there, the weight of keeping secrets that nobody believed. "Coffee sounds good," he said. They sat in her cabin while the storm raged outside, and Opal told him everything. About the covenant, about her family's promise, about the Watchers, that's what she called them, capital W, like it was a title, not a description, who'd been here since before time had meaning. "They don't interfere much," she said, pouring coffee that was somehow still hot. "Mostly they just watch, like the name says. But when someone threatens what they're protecting, when cruelty comes close, then they act. Those men," Frank said, "if I hadn't been here, they would have left anyway. Maybe more scared, maybe less intact. The Watchers don't kill unless they have to, but they make it very clear when you're not welcome." "How long have you known about them?" "All my life. My father showed me when I was 7 years old. Took me into the woods at dawn, left food by a specific tree. We waited, and it came." Her eyes went distant with memory. "I wasn't scared. Should have been, maybe. But all I felt was awe. Like meeting something holy." They talked for an hour, maybe more. Frank asked questions he never thought he'd ask, got answers he never thought he'd hear. When he finally left, the storm was easing, and his understanding of the world had shifted in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Some things, he realized, were bigger than laws and property rights and contracts. Some things were about respect, about keeping promises that outlasted the people who made them, about knowing when to stop pushing, because the line you're crossing isn't just cultural or legal, it's existential. He drove home slowly, chains crunching on snow, and when he got there, he sat in his driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. His wife found him there, staring at nothing. "Frank, you okay?" "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'm okay. Just long night." But he wasn't okay, not really. How could you be okay after realizing the world was bigger and stranger than you'd spent 61 years believing? After meeting something that shouldn't exist but did, and having it look at you with eyes that remembered when your species was young and afraid of the dark for very good reasons. He went inside, took off his uniform, sat at his kitchen table with coffee his wife made, and tried to figure out how to write a report that wouldn't get him committed. In the end, he wrote, "Responded to disturbance at Thatcher property. Situation resolved. No arrests. Recommend property be left undisturbed pending further review." It was the truth, just not all of it. Some truths were too big for forms. Mina Chen heard about the incident the next morning from Frank's dispatcher, who heard it from Frank's wife, who'd heard Frank muttering in his sleep about eyes in the dark and bigger than people think. She drove out to the Thatcher property immediately, her Honda sliding on icy roads, satellite radio cutting in and out as she wound through the valley. The snow had stopped. The world was white and silent, the kind of quiet that feels sacred, like the pause between prayers. When she got to the property, she found Frank's patrol car and another vehicle, Owen Doherty's Forest Service truck. They were both standing at the tree line, looking at something in the snow. Mina got out, camera already in hand. "What have you got?" Frank turned. His face looked older than it had 3 days ago, the lines deeper, the eyes more tired, more tracks. "Want to see?" She walked over and looked down. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into snow that had fallen overnight. Same size as before, same impossible stride. But this time there were more of them, and they told a story. The prints led from the woods to the cabin, circled it once, then returned to the tree line, protective patrol, checking perimeter, making sure nothing had been disturbed. And at the point where they came closest to the cabin, someone had left something. A bundle of stripped cedar boughs, tied with birch bark, placed on the doorstep like an offering or a promise. "She came out this morning and found it," Frank said quietly. "Called me right away. Where is she now?" "Inside. Resting. She's tired, Mina. This whole thing's taking a toll." Mina photographed the tracks, the bundle, the snow disturbed by something walking. Then she knocked on the cabin door. Opal answered. She looked smaller than before, more fragile, but her eyes were still sharp. "Miss Chen, come in." Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar from the bundle, Mina realized. Opal had brought it in, placed it on the table like a centerpiece. "Mrs. Thatcher, I need to tell this story, the whole story, with your permission." Opal was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. "Tell it, but tell it right. Don't make it a circus. Don't make it about Bigfoot hunters and tourists and people looking for Instagram photos. Make it about what it really is, a promise kept, a debt repaid, a reminder that we're not alone and not as important as we think we are." "I can do that." "And Miss Chen, make sure people understand this isn't about fear. It's about respect. The Watchers aren't here to hurt anyone. They're here to protect what matters. As long as people remember that, as long as they treat this land right, there won't be trouble. And if they don't remember?" Opal's smile was sad. "Then the forest will teach them. Same as it's been teaching since before we built towns and drew maps and started thinking we owned the world." Mina's article ran 2 days later. Front page of the Peninsula Gazette, with the headline, "Unnamed Keepers, Protection or Legend at Thatcher Property." She didn't call it Bigfoot. Didn't speculate. Just laid out the facts, the tracks, the woven bark, the incidents, Frank's statement about unexplained occurrences, and Opal's family history of protecting the land. She included the photograph of the prints, the cedar bundle, the rosette woven into the birch tree. And she ended with a question. In a world increasingly dominated by development and extraction, what happens when land fights back? And what do we owe to the places and the beings that were here first? The response was immediate and divided. Half the comments called it folklore, imagination, environmental propaganda. The other half sent letters, stories, photographs of their own encounters with things they couldn't explain. People from all over the peninsula reached out. A woman who'd gotten lost in the woods and been led back to safety by something she never saw clearly. A hunter who'd been about to shoot a doe when something growled from the shadows and changed his mind. A logger from the 1972nd who'd seen his foreman, a man known for cruelty, walk into the forest and come running back out, pale as paper, quitting on the spot and never explaining why. The stories had the same thread. Kindness was remembered. Cruelty was punished. The forest had watchers, and the watchers had long memory. Grant Salvi didn't comment. Within a week, he pulled out of the development deal entirely, put out a press release about unforeseen environmental concerns and respect for local heritage, moved his investment money to a different county, a different project, somewhere without history that went back beyond property deeds. The land stayed wild, and Opal stayed in her cabin, 76 years old and stubborn as the white pines, keeping a promise her family had made over a century ago. The winter deepened. Snow piled higher. The river froze in sections, turned to dark glass where the current ran too fast to stop. Opal's cabin stayed warm, woodpile mysteriously restocked on the coldest nights, always finding new logs arranged precisely where she'd need them. She didn't see the watcher often, didn't need to. Some relationships don't require constant presence. They exist in understanding, in action, in the quiet knowledge that you're not alone even when you're lonely. But sometimes, late at night, when the moon was full and the world was silver, she'd hear it. 3 soft knocks on the cedar siding, patient, deliberate, a message that didn't need words. "I'm here. You're safe. The covenant holds." She'd put her hand against the wall, fingers spread on old wood, and whisper back, "Thank you." Not to the watcher, specifically, to everything, to the forest and the promises and the kindness that circles back when you least expect it, to the mystery of living in a world bigger and stranger than we admit, to the particular grace of knowing you're part of something that will outlast you, that mattered before you were born and will matter after you're gone. In February, during the coldest week of the year, Opal woke one morning to find something new on her doorstep. Not cedar boughs this time, not birch wreaths. A single stone, smooth and river-worn, about the size of a heart, placed dead center on the threshold. Unmistakable, deliberate, she picked it up. It was warm somehow, despite the frozen morning, warm from being held, maybe, or warm from being carried close to something living. She brought it inside, placed it on the shelf next to Raymond's photograph. That stone stayed there, a reminder made physical, that debts get repaid, that promises have weight, that kindness leaves marks in the world that outlast the people who showed it. Some things you pass down aren't written in wills or locked in vaults. They're kept in action, in choice, in the daily decision to honor what came before and protect what comes after. That's legacy, not what you take, what you keep. Mina visited one last time in early March, when the snow was melting and the world was waking up. Mud season, they called it, when everything was thawing and messy and new. She found Opal on her porch, wrapped in quilts, watching the river run high with melt. "How are you doing?" Mina asked. "Tired," Opal said honestly, "but content. That's better than most people get." They sat together in the warming air, not talking much, just being. Eventually, Mina asked the question she'd been carrying. "Do you think they'll ever be seen? Really seen? Photographed, documented, proven to exist?" Opal was quiet a long time. Then she said, "I think they've been seen 1,000 times by people who immediately decided they hadn't. I think we live in a world that's very good at ignoring what doesn't fit. And I think maybe that's okay. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious. Maybe proof isn't the point. What is the point? Respect, wonder, humility." Opal turned to look at her. "We spend so much time trying to control everything, understand everything, own everything. Maybe it's good that there are still places where we can't, where something bigger than us gets to say no." Mina thought about that on her drive home. Thought about it writing her follow-up articles. Thought about it when editors asked her to get more proof, better photos, clearer evidence. She thought about how some stories aren't meant to convince. They're meant to invite, to open doors instead of closing them, to say, the world is bigger than you think, stranger than you believe. And that's not a problem, it's a gift. Opal Thatcher died in her sleep the following winter, December 18th. A cold, clear night when the stars were so bright, they hurt to look at. She was 77 years old. The coroner said it was heart failure, natural causes, peaceful. They found her in her rocking chair, the burgundy scarf folded in her lap, the smooth river stone in her hand. Frank Petrie organized the funeral. Small service, just locals who'd known her. They buried her up on the hill next to Raymond, next to her parents, next to all the Thatchers who'd kept the promise before her. As they lowered the casket, a wind moved through the white pines, not harsh, not angry, just present. And for a moment, everyone at that graveside felt it. The sense of something watching, something grieving in its own way, something acknowledging the passing of one who'd kept faith. Owen Dougherty looked up at the tree line, thought he saw movement there, shadow among shadows. But when he blinked, it was gone. The property stayed undeveloped. In her will, Opal had left it to the Michigan Land Trust with one condition. It must remain wild. No buildings, no roads, no development. Forever. The trust accepted. How could they not? The land was worth more as mystery than as real estate. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, hikers in the area report strange things. Tracks they can't explain. Woven patterns in trees. The feeling of being watched but not threatened. Guided but not controlled. The Forest Service logs these reports, files them, doesn't dismiss them. Because Frank Petrie, before he retired, made sure there was a protocol for it. A recognition that some things exist outside standard explanation, and that's okay. Mina Chen won a regional journalism award for her coverage. Not because she proved anything, because she asked the right questions and let mystery be mysterious. Because she understood that some stories aren't about answers, they're about attention, about noticing what we usually ignore, about respecting what we don't understand. She visits the property once a year, usually in autumn when the light is gold and the air smells like cedar and memory, leaves flowers at Opal's grave, sits on the porch of the now empty cabin, and listens to the forest talk to itself. And every time, without fail, she finds something. A smooth stone on the threshold, a bundle of cedar, a pattern of bent grass that looks almost intentional, messages without words, reminders that the covenant still holds. Here's what I want you to take from this story, if you take anything at all. We live in a world that's wilder and stranger than we admit. A world where kindness has longer memory than we imagine, where promises matter, where land isn't just property, where things we can't explain aren't automatically false. We've gotten so good at paving everything, explaining everything, owning everything, that we've forgotten how to just be in the presence of mystery. We've forgotten that not knowing can be a gift, that some questions don't need answers, that wonder is its own reward. And we've forgotten, or maybe we never learned, that the way we treat the world, the way we treat each other, the way we keep or break our promises, all of that circles back. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in ways we recognize, but it circles back. Opal Thatcher understood that. Her family understood that. They made a promise and kept it for over a century, and when they needed protection, the forest protected them back. That's not mythology, that's math. Different kind of math than we're taught in schools, but math nonetheless. The algebra of reciprocity, the geometry of respect, the calculus of knowing when to stop taking and start giving back. So if this story makes you uncomfortable, good. If it makes you question what's possible, even better. And if it makes you think twice about the land you walk on, the promises you make, the kindness you show or withhold, then maybe it's done what stories are meant to do. Maybe it's opened a door you didn't know was closed. The watchers are still out there. In the Manistee River Valley, in forests you've never heard of, in places that still remember what the world was like before we decided to own it. They're watching, they're listening, they're keeping accounts. And the only question that matters is, when they look at you, at your choices, at how you treat what you can't own, and don't understand, what will they see? I hope they see kindness. I hope they see respect. I hope they see someone who knows that being human doesn't mean being in charge. It means being responsible, being careful, being grateful. Because here's the thing about old promises and ancient watchers and covenants that go back before anyone remembers. They don't expire. They don't fade. They just wait to see if you'll honor them. And the forest has all the time in the world. Thank you for staying with this story, for listening to something that asks more questions than it answers, for being willing to sit in uncertainty and let mystery be mysterious. If you want more stories like this, stories that whisper instead of shout, that respect the unknown, that remember the world is bigger than we think, subscribe to the channel. Share this with someone who needs reminding that wonder still exists. Leave a comment about your own experiences with the inexplicable, the encounters you can't quite explain. And maybe, next time you're in the woods, pay attention. Notice the patterns. Respect the silence. Leave things better than you found them. You never know what's watching. You never know what might remember.